Hello, happy Friday. My name is Lucy Letterhandler. I'm the curator here at the Art Gallery of Southwestern Manitoba, and I'd like to welcome you to this artist talk with Surien Fourie titled Exploring Grief, A Path Without a Mother. Before I bring Surien up, I would like to acknowledge that the AGSM is located on Treaty 2 territory, which has been stewarded by the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples since time immemorial, and which has been the homeland of the Métis Nation for centuries. A reminder for all of our live watchers that you can interact with Surien and myself by typing your questions or comments into the comment section under this video, and we will respond to them after the presentation when I'll come back up on screen. Now to introduce the artist. Surien Fourie is a marketing and communication specialist by day and a creative adventurer by night. She is passionate about self-expression through a wide range of art forms, from painting, singing, photography, jewelry making, and travel writing. Fourie is also an instructor at the AGSM's art school, where she loves to share her knowledge and see students that have eureka moments for themselves. She lives in Brandon. Welcome, Surien.
Thank you, Lucy.
So I'm just going to pop your presentation up on stage, shall I?
Perfect. Well, thank you, Lucy, for that introduction. And thank you all for joining me here today. Welcome to Exploring Grief, A Path Without a Mother. So grief was once described to me, and Lucy, if we could do that video. Grief was once described to me in this way that seems entirely appropriate. Grief is illustrated like a box with a pain button located on the inside and a large ball bouncing around inside the box. When you first lose someone, the ball is large and almost always hits that pain button. But as you continue on the grief journey, the ball gets smaller and smaller, and it seems to not always hit that pain button. Although it still hits it, it's less frequent and sometimes without warning. Now, I think this is a really fitting description of grief. It's the manner in which I experienced grief when I lost my mother, and that's almost 11 years ago now. So this is just a beautiful way of looking at grief. I've heard it described in many different ways, but this particular one I really enjoy. I am someone who really enjoys traveling and going to different art museums and art galleries around the world. And on one of my trips, I actually got the spark for this particular collection. So I was on a trip to South Africa in 2019, where I'm originally from, and I went to Zietsmoka, which is this contemporary art museum in Cape Town. And it's absolutely stunning, as you can see through the photos there. It's actually a converted grain silo that's been converted into this very modern, eclectic museum. And then as a photographer, right, walking through a building like this, it is just amazing to see. But then comes the art, and this art in this museum is incredible. It is so humbling to see these artists because they use their art form as a voice to share stories, be it their stories or political ones or economic ones or anything on social injustices. And what's really incredible is that through this process, they use different art forms to share their stories. And a lot of the stories that they share is either ones that are forgotten or ones that are never shared or ones that need to be reshared because they're so powerful. And I realized while walking through this museum that that's kind of what I wanted to do with my art. But there's one particular painting in 2019 that stuck with me and really spoke to me. And I still think about it today, and I wanted to share that with you. And it's by a Zimbabwe artist called Anthony Brahima, and it was done in 2018. And the reason why this particular piece touched my soul is because half my family, my mother's side of the family, is from Zimbabwe. And so I grew up going to them and visiting there and learning about their politics and just the way they run things there. And so I learned about Mugabe, and this actually, Houses for All, is one of his promises that he made when he ran for president, that he would give everyone houses if they voted for him. And Anthony, in this particular piece, literally using 3 words, some houses and hundreds of little people, says and shares such a powerful and emotional story just through this one piece of artwork. And it really sort of humbled me going through there and seeing this piece. I think I went 3 times, and every time I would sit and look at this piece for quite a while because it just spoke to me. And as I said, this is something that I really wanted to do with my art. I didn't just want to paint pretty pictures, so I wanted to do something that shares a story. But like every creative person goes through, we have that imposter syndrome, where we really start thinking, okay, I want to share my story, but do I have worthy stories to share? Or would anyone even listen to them? Who would like them? Who would want to hear about them? Until I had a friend that came to stop by my house one evening and sort of asked my advice on their grief because they lost a loved one and they were struggling. And I realized after that conversation that there is a story that I have that I can tell, something that I'm well versed in. And it's kind of sad to think that, but in a way it's really amazing because I've helped a lot of people because I've lost 3 really close people in my life. So I wanted to explore grief and the sides of grief and what you go through when you're experiencing grief. So that was the scope of my project that I started. But that definitely grew from there. I decided to sit down and write different words and down to see what this whole collection could be about. And I quickly learned that there's a lot to it, and I could maybe bring in other voices to share the story. And so I kind of reached out to family and friends and asked if they knew of anyone or if they'd share their own stories. of someone who'd lost someone in their lives, and they were willing to talk to me and willing for me to paint their experience. And it was overwhelming, the response that I got. And somehow I ended up with all women that lost their mothers to a certain, like to different illnesses. So it was the scope became narrower, but I think it was such a beautiful experience for me, emotion inducing and healing at the same time, because it was so specific and it's something that I've experienced myself. So I then reached out and did interviews with several women at different stages of their lives, who had all lost their mothers to some type of terminal illness. And some of them, had very short grief journeys. Some had very long. Some had almost sort of been at the healing stage of their grief journey, and some of them are right in the midst of it. So it was very interesting to see those different perspectives. And what was most interesting to me was that somehow, even though we're different people, we come from different cultures, we're different stages of our lives, and we're different moms, different different diseases, we all sort of had very similar, almost, or sometimes almost exact same experiences, which was very interesting to see that mother-daughter relationship playing part of this grief journey that we all went through. So with this collection, my whole process is that I sort of sit down and write down words that represent grief. And so I came up with themes. This is just some of them. So anger, sadness, healing, isolation, chaos, relief, regrets, no goodbyes, loss of identity, and forgiveness. So from these different themes, I painted the collection, of course, but I also found that there was sort of 3 different distinct stages that I painted in. It's not that there's stages, which we'll get to that, of grief for me, but it begins with like the turbulent beginning, where it's confusing and you're trying to feel that anger and maybe some sadness, maybe some guilt, and there's conflicting emotions. Then you get to the messy middle, where there is some healing, but then you get triggered back, and there's this very confusing, chaotic emotional state that you are in. And then it's sort of the healing end, which is where you accept the loss. I'm not trying to say that's the actual end, because I don't believe that you ever overcome a grief like that, losing a parent. I think you just learn to carry that burden better over the years, but it's always with you. So that's sort of the premises and base that I started painting in. Now, from there, I sat with the emotions for a few days. So anger, I sat with that, which I found very destructive. And after a few days, I wrote poems to represent some of these themes and the emotions that I was exploring. And from there, I picked colors and shapes that represented these emotions and concepts. And then from there was the first time I would actually sketch or paint the painting. So let's move on to one slide more. I actually wrote poems. So this is 2 of them. Throughout the presentation, you'll actually get to see more of them. The loss of identity one is actually about, I was my mother's primary caregiver while she was dealing with her cancer. So when she passed away, and then I became my grandmother's primary caregiver, and after she passed away, I sort of lost this identity of being their caregiver. So that's what this particular piece is about in poem. And then Calm Before the Storm, this is in the messy middle stage, where you feel everything. There is this calm before the storm, then you get angry, it's chaos, it's just all over the place, which I'll also cover a little bit later. But that poem is from that particular piece that I did. And in the collection, if you come to the art gallery, you can actually, next to each painting, there's a QR code that you can use to listen to my spoken poem. So all of these poems I've actually voiced, so you can hear the emotion that I'm trying to convey in them. And you can actually look at the painting as you're walking through the hallways. Or if you don't want to listen to them, you can actually read them. They will be in the descriptions as well. Just to sort of give you an idea of what I was feeling and thinking as I was painting the painting. And for me, I need to start in my left logical side of my brain to come to terms with those emotions and really put them to words. Then I can move to the right side of my creative brain and interpret that into paint or whatever art form I would like to. So that's my process. Before I get really deep into the collection and stories from some of the other participants that I interviewed, I just want to give you a little bit of context on my grief journey. I know some of you on here know me, but some of you don't. So I just wanted to read you an excerpt from a journal that I authored. It's called How to Carry the Burden of Grief, Not Overcome It. So it's a grief prompted journal. I just want to read you a quick page here. And the section's called Grief is Love with No Place to Go. So my grief journey starts at a young age when I lost my beloved grandfather that came for a visit and ended up with a third primary cancer, moving into a home for his last year of life. His room was across from mine, and I remember afternoon teas after school, stories told with me lying on the foot of his bed, and watching him wither away as the cancer took its toll on him. My parents made us say goodbye to him the morning he died, just before school. I still remember how cold his skin felt against my lips, but he was still breathing. And on the way there to school, we got the phone call that his suffering was over. I remember being so mad at my parents that they wouldn't let me go home and stay with my grandfather. I had to go to school and carry on as if nothing significant had happened that day. My heavy little heart, at age of 11, did not understand the grief that they spared me from that day. Fast forward 14 years, and I found myself again saying goodbye to a loved one, being present this time as they took their last breath. My mother was first diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer when I was 9, so my grandfather's death gave me a glimpse into what I could expect when her time came. This time, I found myself in a palliative unit, visiting daily, twice a day, as my loved one yet again withered away and finally succumbed to the cancer. I was present in the room when she took her last breath, and I was flooded with relief that the suffering was finally over. Don't get me wrong, it was the hardest loss I had experienced, losing a mother. But the confusing, conflicting emotions I felt in that moment jumbled off my grief journey and made me feel as if there was something wrong with me. I was sad and I mourned, but I carried on because my family needed me, and I was the primary caregiver for my grandmother, who is my mother's mother, who needed me and who lived with us after her husband died. The burden of grief had to be put on hold while I kept everything together for everyone else at that time. Okay. So what I learned and discovered through examining emotions and grief was that, most importantly, grief and emotions are layered. So there's 2 series within the collection that I actually painted a little bit differently to showcase that concept. So there is 6 framed paper pieces in the middle of the collection, in the messy middle, as I call it, that actually were painted. The base layers has collage papers, spray paint, crayons as the base layer, and then they have acrylic inks and oils on top of that. And you can see in the presentation here that there's textured paper, so that's the collage papers coming through. And this is what I'm trying to reveal with this particular concept, was that a lot of times we show anger as the external emotion that we're experiencing, because it's easy to convey and it's easy for other people around us to interpret and understand. So if you pull back the layers, a lot of times it's not anger actually what you're feeling. It might be shame, it might be guilt, it might be maybe you're struggling to forgive that person, or you have regrets. So that's actually the core emotion, and then everything on top of that, you showcase the anger, but that's not it. So this particular series is actually what that's trying to convey, that there's layers, and that's why these layers are peeking through and there's texture. So if you're in the gallery with those particular pieces, there's no gloss on these frame pieces, please go up to them, really look at them, because you can see the texture peeking through. It's really interesting to see. So another part of the series, in the healing part at the end, I also did paint in layers. And with these ones, I painted an acrylic wash on the bottom, and then did oils on top of that. And in this collection, you can see at the bottom, so the two pink ones, the black and brown, is actually the bottom acrylic wash. And with the blue ones, it's the dark blue and brown that's at the bottom. And with this particular collection, I actually painted from dark to light. And there's a reason for that, is because the healing, you're starting to show that you are not visiting your emotions as much, the deeper, darker ones, and that you're getting the grief is getting less. So that's what these particular paintings are representing, the color from dark to light, as well as the different layers peeking through. So there's not one layer that's completely covering the canvas. They are peeking through at all different stages and spots within the canvases. Okay. So for me, I'll jump into the collection now. For me, I was at the healing stage of my grief when I started this collection. So it was actually really difficult for me to jump back in to that grief. And so I had to find a way to do that. And so what I did firstly is I thought about the good times. So that's what this first painting in the collection is actually called Remembering the Good Times. And that's the poem that's associated with it. And it actually represents our family's springtime holidays. Twice a week, 2 weeks every year, we would go to Durban, to Umhlanga, to a beach resort there. And it was the best time for my family because it was time that we would spend together. We would walk on the beach, look for crabs, play hopscotch and laugh a lot because my parents would, have to wind up to try and hop from one spot to the other. And there was a lot of laughs. And those 2 weeks every single year was our happy bubble, when my mom wasn't sick and she didn't have to go for chemo treatments or radiation. So that was just a really happy moment for us in our lives every single year, those 2 weeks at least. So that's what I painted this one in. So the blue and the green represents, of course, the ocean. The pink and white is the sand plus the color schemes of the resorts that we used to stay at. That line at the top there actually represents hopscotch, an abstract version of it. And then the curves and lines and dots represent, of course, the ocean and seashells. So this piece is very calming to me, and this was a pathway for me to get to the other emotions. And so the second piece in the collection, which is Relief It's Over, it actually represents my mom's final week. And I had to go back to that because it was complicated, because everyone expected me to be extremely sad, and don't get me wrong, I was. But I got this when she finally passed away. There was this relief that everything was over, that her suffering was over, that our suffering of seeing her, be in pain, on multiple visits. I said I went twice a day, every single day for months to the hospital. I worked part-time because of that. And this painting represents that. So the blue and the blendedness represents sort of the chaos. That's why there's dark and light. It's sort of blended, not perfectly, but it explains that the chaos that we felt. And then all those lines and things represent sort of the calmness as well. So it's playing that duality of it's sad, but it's also at the same time, it was relief that everything was over. And the poem, I won't read it, but you're more than welcome to. And I also learned through this process of looking at these emotions that grief is not linear. It's not like everyone talks about those stages of grief that you go through. It definitely does not follow that. I feel like it's all over the place. You jump from one to the other, then back. And sometimes people feel that if they triggered back that they haven't healed, and that's not the case most times. It might be that you triggered back just because you need to learn something new. And most importantly about grief as well, that there's no timeline. I feel like I had a friend of ours stop by last week actually and spoke about, she lost someone recently in the last 6 months, and she was saying she was visiting with her family and that because it was, the firsts after they lost this loved one. And it was the first birthdays, the first Thanksgiving, and how difficult it was. And I kind of let it slip that that's not the most difficult. Like it's tough, don't get me wrong, but I think the seconds are the worst. And she kind of got mad at me and I was like, oops. But I think the seconds are the worst because everyone else has moved on and has forgotten that you've experienced this extreme loss that has consumed you completely. And you're still in the midst of it. So for me, year 2 is harder than year 1 because people have kind of isolated you and kind of left you like, okay, you should be over it, because they think, within 6 months or a year you should move on. And for a lot of us, especially if you lose a mother, that relationship you had, you don't get over it. It's not a year journey. I'm almost 11 years into it and I am still grieving at times. Even the other day I was triggered and I was in a funk for a few days, but I had to feel all of that emotion for me to move on. So the next few paintings that I'm going to talk about is actually from one of the women I talked to regarding her grief journey, and she agreed to share her story on video format here today. And you'll hear her grief story, what she learned, what advice she would give to someone who's going through this grief journey, and what it felt like for her to have her story painted and represented and interpreted by me. Now, this person's grief journey, she's sort of at the healing stage compared to the other one that you'll see later. So this is Joanne Hall and her story.
One thing that surprised me the most, I would think, was how angry I was initially. Unless maybe it was just a way to avoid my sadness, but I was really angry at the start. Angry at the doctors for waiting so long to diagnose. Sometimes angry at my mom for not pushing things more with her treatments. And often angry at myself or guilt maybe for missing something or not doing enough, or I don't know, I seem to be consumed a lot for a long time with just being angry, really angry. I'd go to bed and just get myself worked up and cry. And gradually it went away, and then it was a really deep sadness, just missing her. And also she was sick for so long, at times I felt like I'd forgotten the real her, and my memory was of the sick her. And so I would try to think back to like farther memories, and that would make me sad. And gradually it became less and less. And I would say through the whole process, it was really lonely. Even though I had my husband, my kids, I had siblings, I had my dad, it was a very lonely journey, I would say. And that surprised me, I guess. And, people seem to shy away from you when you're experiencing grief because they don't know what to say or do. So people tend to avoid you, and that's really more isolating. I think that would be one thing I would say to people who know someone, like have a friend, and they've had someone pass close to them. Don't avoid them, right? They need you, and you don't need to say anything specific, right? Just being present and listening. As time went by, time really does heal, and gradually I would think about my mom or my anger or my sadness less and less, and you get busy just living life, and there'd be just times where all of a sudden it would hit me out of the blue. I remember shopping for ingredients to make a cake for my daughter's birthday, and all of a sudden crying in Sobeys because I'm thinking my mom's not going to be there, right? So today, it's all good memories and funny stories. And, you know, when I talk about my mom or think about her, it's usually because I did something that reminds me of her. Or maybe I've said something to my kids that I'm sure she said to me. And the sadness, the anger, it's gone, and it's really joy and happiness in the memories. I think one thing I learned was compassion for others who will be experiencing this in the future. Like just the patience and humility and how to listen rather than talk at people. I think before all of this, I would be a talker and advice giver. And now I've learned far better how to be a listener, which I appreciated when people would be with me and just listen instead of talking to me. And I've learned a lot from my mother through this experience, I would say. Just how to persevere, how to be brave, how to really, there is nothing to fear. Her faith was so strong that it really inspired the rest of our family to believe that there is something after, right? She totally was confident and fearless in her faith. And whether my brother, who would admit it or not, if he believed in the afterlife, he was definitely affected by her faith. And I think that's a wonderful thing that came out of this. And I would say it's made me more patient with my family, with my children, just to see what's really important and maybe the legacy I want to leave for them. I think it's a very interesting idea to use the medium of paint to express the feelings of grief, because it's so hard to express in words. And so I thought it was a great idea. I was very curious to see what you would paint. I found playing the piano was a great relief for expressing myself when words were hard to come by. So I get the idea of using a different medium to express your feelings and your thoughts. And I was super excited to see what you would do with this.
Okay, so that was Joanne Hall and her story of grief. And these were the three paintings that came from that discussion previously. So the first two, Overwhelming Calmness and Fearless, is actually from, sparked from the conversation that her mother's faith was so strong that she was completely calm, she wasn't scared of dying. And the Fearless one is specifically actually a story that she told about her brother, that he didn't fear little things anymore or really anything because his mother was fearless when it came at the end. And then the last one, you heard her several times talk about sort of the isolation and feeling alone. So that isolation of grief is from that particular discussion. And all these paintings, the isolation one, I tried to represent that emotion as they were talking about it. The words that they used, I would jot that down. And that's what I sort of sat in those emotions and painted this. So the isolation of grief one, I made like a patchwork of colors and made the colors feel isolated. And then also sort of, it makes you feels, to me, it makes me drags my emotional state down. So that's why it's isolation of grief. The fearless one has very bold colors, something that I don't normally paint in reds and oranges, and blue. I was a little scared it might be a little bit more like Superman colors, but it turned out great. And then it also has, if you really look close to it, it has very bold oil pastel markings on there as well. So if you see it in person, really go up to it and look at it. It was a really fun painting to paint, and I've actually used it in a lot of other things, that particular painting. And the overwhelming calmness, even though it's calmness and it's supposed to be overwhelming, I wanted to represent a duality again that people experience. Yes, she's calm that she's dying, but she's also leaving her family. And so that's why there's the blended background again, but then there's still objects on there, still shapes, and it's still movement throughout the piece. So the next one, there's another woman that I spoke to regarding her grief journey. In the next video, she'll be sharing that. So that's Carla Reimer. And she lost her mom about 3 years ago now. So she's in a very different stage than Joanne. She's in the midst of her grief still, but she allowed us a glimpse into her thoughts, her feelings, and her process in this next video.
And that was, well, it started about 12 years ago, I guess, when my mom was diagnosed with Parkinsonism. And that was right around the same time that we found out that we were pregnant with our first child. And so her first grandchild too, actually. Yeah, so we didn't really know what it was. We just knew that her health was deteriorating, and the initial diagnosis didn't really give us a concrete answer. So by the time my son was born, so within that year, she was diagnosed with multiple system atrophy, which had a much more drastic timeline. So I guess there was a lot of denial in the beginning. For us, we used humor and distraction a lot. And yeah, I guess through that time, as I became a mom myself, but was losing my mom at the same time, there was a lot of jealousy of my friends that had their moms to take care of their kids or just be there to do things with their kids. It was a lot of ambiguous kind of, my mom isn't here because there's this disease that has prevented her body from working. So she wasn't there, but she was there. And just that like complicated tension, I guess, of grieving someone that is still here. And then 3 years ago in January, my mom passed away. So it kind of like rebooted the whole grief thing. And yeah, and so it's just been a process of almost experiencing all of those things again, the same way, but different. I learned that I'm still learning about grief. Yeah, I'm still going through it. So it feels like a tricky thing to answer when it still throws me off from time to time. But I guess mostly that it's not linear at all. It's the steps that everyone kind of goes through or talks about. Those don't happen the way they think it does. It's kind of like all over the place. I guess learning to feel all of those emotions that come with grief. Feeling them is better than not feeling them, or allowing myself to. And I guess just trying to understand a little bit better. It's yeah, you learn a lot about yourself. You learn a lot about how grief affects everything in your life once it's touched your life. And yeah, it's just I've learned it's not simple. It's not like it's not simple. It's always been a tension of both and kind of for me. Like something really good will happen, but I'll be really sad because my mom couldn't be a part of that in our lives. So trying to, yeah, just I guess I've been learning how to feel that at the same time and accept that this thing of grief is just it's just with me forever now. It's just never going to go away, um and accepting that. So first it was like kind of like uncomfortably wonderful to have a discussion with someone whose mom also has passed away. So there's that like understanding of grief. So it was, yeah, it to have that conversation and have that space felt safe. And it felt, yeah, it felt honest. So I could be honest about that, and I could share without feeling like I had to explain anything um, to you. So that made it easier to have the conversation and to share a little bit of my grief and all of the things that we talked about in that conversation. Um, so it felt really comfortable, felt safe for me. Um, but it also felt like a huge honor that you pulled something out of that inspired you to to paint the things that you painted. And um, yeah, I guess I was fascinated with what you came up with out of that little conversation that we had. I guess it wasn't really that little, but it was a short conversation in a larger weekend that we spent together. And yeah, I guess it was just really neat for me to see how um, when I felt safe to express my grief and talk about all of that stuff, how it was received and like portrayed, I guess, on your side. So yeah, it was just really neat to see how um, you saw my words in colors and texture and all of that stuff, and how um, I don't know. Yeah, I guess I just don't know if I would have painted the same colors or any of that if I was given that task with the conversation that I had. So it was really, yeah, it was just really neat um, to see that on canvas.
So these were the two paintings that I painted from my discussion with Carla. So the first one is No Goodbyes. And both of these actual concepts are new ones for me. These are some of the things that surprised me because I never experienced that. I was, of course, as I said, like in the room, or I said goodbye to them right before they passed away. So having the opportunity to have closure really helped me in my grief journey. And because Carla's mom passed away 3 years ago, that was in the midst of COVID and very strict restrictions. So there was only a few of them that could not see their mother at all. So they had to be visiting through the window of the personal care home. But of course, her mother, because of her disease, was nonverbal and could only really respond by blinking. So it was really difficult for her brothers to really say goodbye and be there. So this is what that painting represents. And just trying to think to your left of your painting, that very scribble like brushstrokes. If you're actually in the art gallery and you look at it, I've mixed wax with the oils, and so there's texture to it, and it's kind of crazy to represent that you're kind of, again, the duality of, you know, you're sad that you can't say goodbye, but it's you know, there's all these conflicting emotions that you're feeling, and that's what these shapes and these movements of those shapes are representing. And the next piece, Not Prepared, is one where she talked about, you know, this journey was 12 years long for her, and there's so many times that her mother, you know, got really sick, and they thought this was going to be the end, and then she would recover, and so when it actually happened, when she passed away, she felt like she wasn't prepared for it. And that was an interesting concept to explore as well. And that's why there's a lot of blacks and reds in this one. But then there's this kind of, this really off yellow. And that off yellow is sort of shaking that feeling of like, you kind of were prepared, but you weren't. Just that weird feeling that you get. So that's what that weird yellow is representing actually in the that particular painting. So there's two more paintings that I just want to discuss quickly, and these are part of my story when it comes to the grief. So the first one here is Blinded by Moments, and this is one that I still experience today. And it's basically that concept when you are perfectly fine one moment, and then the next you are bawling your eyes out in public, like Joanne Hall said, with buying cake for her daughter's birthday cake and then crying in Sobeys. I've had this many times, either when you hear their favorite song of your loved one, or someone, you know, walks past you and they're wearing the same perfume that your mother used to wear, or you literally just driving, this is what happens to me a lot, and the sun is hitting trees in the fall, and the colors are just so beautiful because my mother loved fall and the fall trees. And I would literally have to pull off to the side of the road because the tears would just be streaming and I can't see where I'm driving. So that's always fun. And so that's what this piece represents, these sweeping lines and shapes. It's sort of like how you feel you're perfectly fine. The next minute you're smacked inside the head. You're blindsided by these emotions that just take you down. And unfortunately, with these type of things, you can't just like sniffle and pretend you're not experiencing it. You actually need to feel the emotions. And so you just kind of have to cry in public, make people around you very uncomfortable, but it's the only way to sort of work through those emotions. So that's what this piece represents, one of my favorite ones, because as I said, I still experience this particular thing every now and then in my life. And the last painting that I wanted to talk about is forgiveness. Now, I wrestled with this concept for a while of forgiveness, because what does forgiveness look like? What does it feel like, taste like? I was trying to conceptualize what forgiveness is, and why at times is forgiveness really easy and why it's really not at times. And what happens if you're trying to forgive someone that is not there anymore? So forgiveness for me, like I was angry and I wanted to confront a person so I could, you know, we could work it out and then, you know, forgiveness would happen. But what if they're not there? So that's what this painting represents. That's why the blending colors is sort of very streaked and striped. It's that confusion and sort of anger, but you need to forgive, because through this process, what I've learned is forgiveness is actually not about the other person. Forgiveness is an act of self-love, and it's showing yourself to be like, you need to forgive because you don't want those destructive, angry emotions to bring you down and to eat away at you. And so the forgiveness is an act of self-love for you. And I love this painting because of that. It represents a time that I had to learn how to forgive someone that was already gone. And it's a huge feat for me. So that's why I love this particular painting. So yeah, I hope this collection of work invites you to connect with your feelings of grief and loss, but also provides a deeper understanding of the courage it takes to heal and move forward after you've lost a loved one. So yeah, any questions?
Thank you so much, Surien. That was really, really interesting. And I realized that I neglected to say that the reason we're having this artist talk is because your exhibition, Soul Bearing, opened yesterday in the AGSM Community Gallery, and I really do encourage everybody to come down and have a look at these works in person. I obviously, you know, in working with you, saw them digitally a lot, and then once I was actually seeing their physicality, there's something so materially satisfying about them, right? In some cases, it's very pastiness. In some cases, it's just a real generosity of painting that exists in them when you see them in person. So I did want to ask you, again, while we wait for people to ask any questions in the comments or make any comments that you'd like to, we can see those here, about the formal qualities of these paintings, right? In terms of explaining abstraction, when you first described this project to me, I think, you know, quite predictably thought that when you were talking about expressing grief through abstract painting, it was going to be about the physicality of it, about the motions, right? About the what, you know, anger makes your brush want to do, and it's not. You're very, very syntactical about your approach. So can you talk a little bit about that, about how you create a formally successful abstract painting while you're doing all of this research?
Well, I don't really, I kind of just poured out of me. I think the big thing for me, as I said, like my normal process is really just painting, right? And then for this particular project, I had to use my left side of my brain first and write these poems first to really conceptualize the emotions and the feelings, because it was my own and I had to dig deep. And of course it was others that I had to sit with and understand, put myself in their shoes and and think, like, maybe if I experienced it, let's say my mother died and I wasn't in the room with her and I wasn't allowed to see her, how would that make me feel? How would that change my journey? And it was really interesting to experience that. And as a marketer, like, I tell stories and understand sort of layers of that. So it was really interesting. And yeah, that's how I just wrote the poems, and then from there painted the emotion. But I know it was interesting when you was talking about the types of let's say the brush strokes or the mark making, right? Some of the paintings has that, like the Fearless one has the bold marks, because that was just that emotion was very much, I could paint it that way. But a lot of them, as I said, there was this duality. It's not one distinct emotion. So it isn't, you couldn't do like one brush stroke or one style of brush stroke to represent that, because it's this conflicting, chaotic mess of emotions that you're experiencing, and trying to put that into paint, it was difficult. But I took my time, and yeah, how it came out.
So this is, I think, at the root of like how intensely researched this project is that obviously everything is going to be dual and complicated and untidy, right? This is the nature of this life experience, right? That's the nature of the universality of it. So by using, say, painting instead of piano, like your first interview there did, what you're forcing yourself to do is to frame everything in a composition, right? Is to make sense of it as you're working through that, again, incorrectly presumed to be just completely intuitive, right? You are actually inserting a lot of discipline into it. So as far as the process for you, not just the grief journey process, but the process of creating these paintings, the therapeutic elements, was there a detachment or a diving into?
Not detachment.
Not the opposite of that.
I literally had actually a family member tell me as I was painting, as I was nearing the end, they said, you realize that you was going through the grief journey again. Because I literally went through times of depression and sadness. And when there was that angry paintings I was painting, I was angry. And I didn't understand why I was angry in the rest of my life. I thought you could separate yourself and you could paint it. And then, but no, it's sort of like for that 4 months, I really lived it. And there was a point I wanted to make. lost my train of thought.
I started with the composition and then went further off, but that idea of things need to work.
The thing that I learned through this process as well is using the elements of art and design principles, right, to make your composition strong,
right,
but then to use the emotional color wheel, because a lot of colors mean different things in different societies, different cultures. And I was playing around with them because red, right, could be conveyed as danger or anger, but could also be passion, right? So getting that balance between the different colors and the different tones and tints of the colors, that's where sort of that whole expression came from. And so I said, like that one painting with that really awful yellow, I don't like it, but it represented that particular emotion that it needed to be in that painting. So yeah, playing around with those colors it's actually, I'm now really excited. I try different things like that now in my rest of my collections, because it's just an interesting way of looking at and experiencing, trying to convey emotion in the art using the colors.
There's also a running theme that you avoid this word in this very word-based exhibition of bravery, right? Of the open wound, right? And I think sitting with the discomfort of a color you don't like, experimenting with things that aren't really your taste, just like So Fearless, for example, you said, I never would have painted this, but, the rules that I set said I had to paint this.
Yeah.
And then obviously your interviewees, very brave in sharing these stories, without a doubt. So can you talk a little bit about leaving it out and the presence of it?
Well, I also wanted to leave some ambiguous. I wanted people to experience the collection, and also I didn't want to tell them exactly what they needed to experience, and I wanted them to walk through it and hopefully learn something from it and maybe take something of that away. That's why my ending comments was about understanding the courage it takes for someone to firstly become vulnerable and share your story, and to become vulnerable, just, as I said, like you literally sometimes would burst into tears in the middle of doing anything, and making other people around you uncomfortable, because grief is, even though all of us experience grief, it's like we don't understand it. And especially that, as I said, like there's no timeline. Everyone literally expects you within a year or 6 months, you need to be over it. And a lot of times people aren't. And they take a really long time, depending on the type of loss you're experiencing. Yeah. And so I didn't want to paint that and put it in people's faces. I wanted them to interpret it in their own way, because that's what I love about abstract art. It's subjective. And that's why I even said with the paintings in the Zitsmoka, like I was actually there with some Canadian friends of mine, and they liked very different pieces that I liked, because certain ones, because of my experience and my culture, speaks to me very differently than it does to them. So that's why I didn't want to kind of push it in people's faces. I wanted them to experience and take whatever they needed from the paintings.
Right. I'm going to ask one more. If anybody has any pressing questions, there's still time, but we're reaching the hour mark. Again, about that, the materiality of the painting. I know that you're also a digital photographer, which is something that you've shared with the AGSM community quite a bit as well. It's almost the opposite, right? This incredibly material practice, and the Bumhira, Anthony Bumhira, is that his name?
Yeah.
Very, very material piece. And that's what really spoke to you, as opposed to this almost purely visual experience of digital photography. But in your bio, it says that you use all of these things to express emotion. Is there a message that lends itself to one medium more than another, or are you constantly experimenting with all of these things that you do?
I would say I'm probably constantly experimenting with everything. Even in my photography classes, I always caveat when I talk about editing, and because everyone as a photographer, normally they say you should have one editing style and that should be your style for like the rest of your career. That's not me. I don't want to be put in a box. And I always edit according to what story I want to tell, so the emotion I want to convey, or if I'm in a specific location, I want to have that location edited the same way, so they can experience that. So I change and experiment, and like right now I'm experimenting with collage papers and transparent papers to create layered effects of things. My family always called me, I'm a constant student. I will always be a student. So I love to experiment. And I use all of these. And sometimes that's why someone asked me, like, are you ever in a rut? I'm like, no, because I just switched to a different medium. If something's not working in painting, I just switch to photography, or I switch to singing or dancing or whatever I want to do. So, yeah.
Great. And kind of, well, I don't know. I've never really been much of a photographer myself, but it does make some sense that in that alone time between you and your computer, that there could be a lot of good reflection happening there, right?
Absolutely. And that's one thing as well, even with my paintings, after I've painted them, I actually sit in the art studio with them for a while, just to let them, and this might sound really weird, to let them talk to me.
Sure.
If they maybe want something more done, or like, no, I'm actually done, just leave me alone. It really, if you sit with it for a while, you'll know if there's anything you need more to the piece. So
great. And such a good moment to end on. Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for joining us live, and anybody watching after the fact. Surien Fourie's exhibition Soul Bearing is up in the community gallery all the way through the new year into mid-January. So please do come on by, visit it, maybe during Gala of Gifts, which is on November 25th, maybe during the member show, which will open on December 1st, November 30th, Thursday after that. Yeah. So thanks again, and I'll look forward to seeing you more.
Thank you.